The United States, in the course of negotiating trade agreements with many other countries, those agreements often have a chapter that is reserved for government procurement to make sure that those parties signing the agreement each open up their markets so that there's a reciprocal access, meaning U.S. companies can sell their goods into a different market and that be reciprocal in nature. The problem, though, is that doesn't always play out in real life.
Hey, I'm super thrilled to be joined on the podcast today by Scott Bowes. Scott is our Senior Vice President for Governmental Affairs and Policy at the Alliance for American Manufacturing. Scott, I think, is the world's foremost expert on Build America, Buy America, is a massive Eagles and Penn State fan. I share one of those fanships with him, and is the smartest guy I know about trade and manufacturing policy. Scott, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Scott. Yep, I'm a long-suffering fan of the Eagles, Penn State, and Buy America.
Yeah, there we go. All right, so we have a lot to unpack. This administration started with a flourish. I'm sure that folks have no doubt seen that. We're going to look at the memo that President Trump signed on his first day in office. It's called America First Trade Policy. And it's important here to distinguish from what the president has said, because he's talked about tariffs a lot, both on social media and before audiences and with the journalists, and what the administration has set in motion. And we're going to try to do that. And bear with us, because this memo is long and detailed, and it lists 23 distinct issues and recommendations and reports that it wants in a short amount of time by April the 1st. And we're going to go through these rapid fire so that you know all the balls that are now set in motion and ready to roll. Okay. And so we're going to kick this off with the first report that this memo calls for. And it is an investigation into the cause of trade deficits in goods, some of the implications of that, and making some recommendations about how to remedy that. The Commerce Department is going to do that with the Treasury Department and the U.S. Trade Ambassador. Scott Bowes, why is this necessary? What is it about?
Well, Scott, there's a lot of reasons why there could be a trade deficit between the United States and another country. It could be because of, illegal distortions of dumping and subsidies, or perhaps that government is propping up its state-owned enterprises or what have you. But what's clear for all the different reasons is when you don't do anything about it, unfair trade creates trade deficits. It impacts companies and workers and communities in a very negative way. We've seen data that 3.7 million American jobs, 3/4 of which, were manufacturing, were lost over the course of, a 15-year period when China entered the WTO. So, for context, China is the biggest trade deficit, but they're not the only one. And I'm sure that the Trump administration will be looking at Mexico, which has about, some are going to argue the trade deficits don't matter. We think they do. And it'll be interesting to see what the Trump administration comes out of this with. And a reminder, it's not just the economic effects, it's the national security impacts. And this administration has noted that in their memo. So all eyes are on the president to see how he, parlays this into further action.
Indeed, just a couple of quick notes I want to add. There was a trade deficit review commission like a political generation ago that produced a big, thick report, but no action at all. And so I think that's important, that this is not unprecedented, that we've tried to look at this before. Hopefully it results in action this time.
All right, to the next issue. This is an interesting one. It's getting a lot of attention, but the creation of an external revenue service. We all know about the IRS, which is, sends you those pesky forms and letters that you have to fill out in order to do your taxes by April 15th. But Scott Paul, what the heck is the External Revenue Service, and what is it going to do?
I don't know, is the short answer. The long answer is that we obviously already have a collection mechanism to collect duties and tariffs from imports that are subject to them, whether it's the result of a regular tariff schedule or because they're subject to some other trade actions like anti-dumping or countervailing duties that might have been imposed. And that's through the U.S. Customs Service, which is housed under the Department of Homeland Security now. So it's interesting because this is important because the revenue source that can be derived from tariffs is of interest to some in the administration and some in the Congress who want to offset the costs of some of the tax policy changes that they want to make. And so I think it's interesting for that reason. I think it's interesting also for another reason is that we collect virtually no revenue compared to our overall, revenues collected through corporate, individual, and other taxes through tariffs. It is a tiny, tiny percentage of revenues that are collected right now. And that was not always the case. About 125 years ago, we collected a healthy amount of revenue through tariffs. And probably for the first 100 years of our country, we collected virtually all of the revenue that our government ran on through tariffs. And so there's again some interesting history behind this, but we'll see how this ends up. And I know that this would ultimately require an act of Congress to create an external revenue service to do this. Scott Bowes, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't think it comes as a surprise that folks in Congress and this Trump administration, there's not a lot of love for the IRS. So there also may be, a desire, and I think Trump stated this on the campaign trail, to get rid of the tax code and replace it with, operating our government based on a smaller government, I suppose, based on tariffs. So some of that seems a little wild, but yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how they maneuver with this.
Awesome. Okay, on to number three. This is calling on the United States Trade Representative, together with the Treasury Department, the Commerce Department, and the Senior Counselor for Trade and Manufacturing at the White House, who is Peter Navarro, to review unfair trade practices of our trading partners and to recommend potential actions under an array of authorities. And this is, again, kind of like just a code of numbers, 232, 301, and a whole bunch where we could impose tariffs. Scott Bowes, what do you make of this?
Yeah, Scott, I think you hit it on the head. This outlines the various, sections of U.S. code where we have all of our different trade, remedy, and enforcement tools codified and available to policymakers and the administration and to private parties, workers, companies to go about seeking, a remedy when their interests are infringed upon. I think the one that sticks out here, given the news cycle, is Section 1701 of Title 50. That would be IEPA, or the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Some are speculating that that may be the mechanism by which President Trump seeks to impose broad-based tariffs or global tariffs, or, broadly, however you want to put it. So that's a broad mechanism. It applies universally to all countries. I think it's set at 10% or some higher number. Whereas, many of these other items that are listed in the EO are more specific and targeted, seeking to deal with customs issues or, trade remedy laws or what have you. But yeah, I think that IEPA one, it's the one that stands out. All right. Next up, Scott Paul, for you is the United States, Mexico, Canada Agreement, formerly known as NAFTA. The next section here calls upon various government entities, namely USTR, to review its impact and to figure out a report to Congress on how it's impacted ranchers, manufacturers, their businesses. And critically, at the end, it talks about Section 4611B of Title 19, more jargon. But that one is important because in 2026, there's a key date, and the United States has the ability to trigger a joint review mechanism. So, Scott Paul, what is that and what should we expect?
Yeah, well, this was one of the trade, I guess, accomplishments of the first administration that Trump had, which was to renegotiate the North American Free Trade Agreement. There was a lot of dissatisfaction with that. Democrats had a lot of dissatisfaction with that. And so Trump, Nancy Pelosi, others struck a deal to create a new trade agreement, one that was a little more labor and manufacturing friendly. And it was groundbreaking in a number of ways. Ultimately, it's shown that there's still some loopholes that need to be closed, still some things that need to be worked out. And interestingly, both Mexico and Canada agreed to this review because they thought that Trump would be out of office by now. They intentionally wanted it to land on this date because they thought even if there were two consecutive Trump terms that he'd be done and they'd be dealing with another administration. Well, It turns out that is not the case at all. And so I will also say Trump is not the only one who would want to make changes to the USMCA, but this particular part of the executive memo is telling the agencies to get this started right away, not to wait until 2026, so that we can be rolling ready to go. And something Trump has said that he was going to do was impose 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico for reasons not related to the USMCA, but that might also well be a bargaining chip to achieve a better outcome for him. We'll move to number 5, and that calls on the U.S. Treasury Department to review the currency and monetary policies of our trade partners, including currency manipulation, and to recommend measures to counter it. Scott Bowes, what is this all about?
This is a pretty heady subject, Scott. Basically, countries, whether it ranges from Japan back, decades ago, or China more recently, or many other countries, frankly, they either directly intervene to adjust the value of their own currency relative to the U.S. dollar, or they take other, policies that make it misaligned, whether they're directly intervening or doing things that indirectly make it misaligned. The ultimate outcome is that, it makes U.S. products sold to the world more expensive, and it makes products made in those countries that are intervening and messing with their currency, it makes them cheaper when U.S. consumers try to buy them. So you can understand how that has a competitive aspect for U.S. companies and workers. It's a negative one. So what this does is it asks Treasury to identify the countries that are currency manipulators, and there's some nuance there and some limitations in law which we could talk about, but ultimately, I think this is positive. It's a real issue and it's kind of flying under the radar in recent years. Treasury does have some authority to do something about this. And more broadly, under our trade laws, there's opportunities to make sure that petitioners, whether it's companies or workers, are able to file what's called as a countervailing duty case, and to make sure that that's streamlined, accessible, and that they themselves, whether the government does it or private parties bring a case, that they can try to counter those negative effects of currency manipulations. Important issue, and we'll see how bold they go on it.
The only thing I would say is that this authority already exists. You alluded to it. Trump used it a couple of times in his first term to declare currency manipulators. A lot of that was for unrelated reasons. We can be pretty candid about that. So it'll be interesting to see how it's utilized this time, how it will turn out, and also looking at the fact that a lot of countries might look to lower the value of the currencies to offset tariff policy as well. So another factor mixed in there.
Next issue up is trade agreements. The United States has a number of different trade agreements to which it's a party, whether they're bilateral, meaning it's just the United States and one other country, or perhaps multilateral, where it's the United States and several other countries all signing onto an agreement. And then there's sectoral trade agreements under the Biden administration. They advanced, critical minerals agreements, which are a whole complex issue. Anyway, this Scott recommends that they took a look at those. So what are they looking for?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I think they're specifically looking to see how reciprocal they are. And reciprocal is like, are we benefiting as much as the other countries? And so are we running trade deficits? Do we have the market access? Is the agreement living up to the standards that were promised? I also have to believe that part of this is going to be mixed in with which countries are supporting the United States in other ways, whether it's with defense budgets for mutual security, or standing up to China and Russia, or looking at other U.S. interests. And so there's a lot that I think is going to be involved with this, but it'll be interesting to see the outcome, because I don't project that we're going to see any new free trade agreements in this administration, just as we did not see any during the Biden administration, or really other than the renegotiated NAFTA, the USMCA, in the first Trump administration. So I have a feeling that streak will continue, but we'll see what this report gets us. So let's move to number 7, and this is sort of related, and this is one in a provision under which the U.S. Trade Representative will identify market access opportunities, countries to target for agreements like that. Scott Bowes?
Well, I think, Scott, as you noted, there's not a great chance that there'll be new free trade agreements in the next 4 years, or at least not immediately, with all of the emphasis being on enforcement and correcting the ones we have. It's notable that both under Trump's first administration and also President Biden, we did not enter into new agreements. In fact, Trump very quickly pulled us out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations to make sure we were not a part of that, which was a pretty flawed negotiated agreement. So why do they throw this in there? Look, there's politics involved. There's a lot of members of Congress who are constantly demanding that the administration, whether it's Democrat or Republican, there's always bipartisan interest from some states who are more export driven. They want to see that there's emphasis, but I think they even understand that there's been a misalignment in recent years, too much emphasis on expansion and not enough emphasis on enforcement and making sure that the ones we have are working. So that was the emphasis under Ambassador Tai, was making sure that we had a worker-centered, focus on trade, making sure the ones we have are enforced and working. So, I expect that largely to carry over with this new administration. I don't think there's a ton of daylight on that approach. And I would expect that, they would focus on renegotiating USMCA and, unclear if they'll get to advancing discussions with like the UK and Kenya and others where there's some preliminary discussions underway. All right. Well, moving right along, the next section up is an interest that is very important for U.S. companies and workers, especially those who are in import-sensitive industries, is the use of our trade remedy laws. This is anti-dumping and countervailing duty laws, often the last line of defense when, companies and their workers are facing unfair trade. So, much like when you have your iPhone and it tells you to do an update so you can, be safe against hackers. Scott, have we done that with AD/CVD? Have we made sure they're modernized and, they're keeping up with all the new threats that are out there? And I think that's what this section gets at.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to see the outcome of this, because I do think that we've made some gradual improvements in the application of anti-dumping and countervailing duty laws. Some of that has been done through statute. Some of that is done through the regulatory process. But as you point out, there's always room for improvement. It's like playing a game of whack-a-mole at the carnival, that the threats are always evolving and changing, and the laws need to keep up with that, in fact, get ahead of it. And so this specifically asks to look at transnational subsidies, which I think are not well addressed currently. Issues like zeroing that are kind of technical, but very important for calculating dumping for domestic industries and workers to protect them. And so there's also some legislative remedies that are being proposed, something called the Leveling the Playing Field Act 2.0. So it'll be interesting to see whether any of those recommendations are incorporated into what Commerce eventually reports out to President Trump on this, Scott Vose.
I think it's a little bit fascinating that they specifically talk about zeroing, which is a bit of an affront to the World Trade Organization, which has already, tried to end that practice. But it's interesting to do that. It kind of demonstrates this Trump administration's, disinterest in whatever the WTO wants to tell us to do. So that'll be a fascinating storyline as well.
All right, number 9, the Treasury Department, along with the Department of Commerce, Homeland Security, the Senior Counselor for Trade and Manufacturing at the White House and USTR, will assess the revenue loss from something called de minimis and recommend modifications. This is also covered also a little bit in a kind of a later recommendation as well. They'll have some crossover, but we can start it here. What is de minimis? What kind of revenue do we lose from it? And what ought to be done for this, Scott?
Well, de minimis is a procedure by which products, individual packages can come into the United States. And as long as they're under a certain monetary amount, in this case, $800, then they can kind of ease right into the country. They don't have to pay, fees or any duties. And in often cases, it's understood that they are able to bypass even inspections. They get less scrutiny. That's the bottom line. And if $800 is the value now, that was changed a little less than 10 years ago. It was, I think, $200 at the time. And, since that time, certain companies around the world and other countries, enabling those companies, have figured out that this is a bit of a loophole into our system of government. It allows packages to get right by any trade enforcement, tariffs, or other fees that would normally apply. So it's had a really detrimental impact on U.S. companies and workers, especially in industries like textiles, where you have China's fashion companies sending packages directly from a factory in China directly to front doors, from fast shipping companies all over the country, and at impossibly low prices. And there's all sorts of implications here, not just for workers and companies, but also there's questions, and the president has raised this in this executive order about fentanyl, about whether, illicit contraband and drugs are being smuggled into the United States and bypassing inspections by virtue of using this de minimis loophole. So it's a multi-pronged threat, and it's one that I do expect the president and this administration to be very forceful on. Congress, frankly, has dithered on the issue and is really not, as much as they all say they want to do something on it, we have not seen the action that has been necessary to deal with this. It's a loophole that is unfettered, wide open, and needs to be addressed immediately. So, glad to see they've taken this on, and I really hope they follow through. It's, people's lives are in danger because of this one. Their economic welfare and their jobs are in danger. This is one that really stands out on this list that is a low-hanging fruit that needs to be addressed right away.
Agree.
Well, with that, Scott, we'll move to the next one. And this one's a bit wonky, so spare our audience too much detail, perhaps. But this one calls on Treasury and Commerce to basically look into whether other countries are subjecting our citizens or companies to unfair taxes. I didn't even know that was the case. I thought we only taxed our own citizens. How does that work?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a question for an international tax policy expert, of which I am not one. So I know that this is a major concern for a number of Republicans on Capitol Hill, and I have to imagine that this will also inform the process of tax policy changes that the Congress is looking at. And also, I think this is colored a little bit by Republicans and some of the global business community not particularly enjoying the Biden administration's approach to international taxation. So why don't we park it there, and we'll see what happens on that. Important, but maybe not from a Alliance for American Manufacturing perspective as important as some of these other issues. So we'll move on to number 11. And this is the United States Trade Representative, along with the Senior Counselor for Trade and Manufacturing, reviewing trade agreement and WTO procurement rules and making recommendations to make sure that they're fair. Why is this important, Scott Bowes?
Well, the United States, in the course of negotiating trade agreements with many other countries, those agreements often have a chapter that is reserved for government procurement. And the purpose of that is to, at least on paper, to make sure that, those parties signing the agreement each open up their markets so that there's a reciprocal access, meaning U.S. companies can sell their goods into a different market when that government is buying products, whether they're buying pencils, furniture, desks, construction materials to build government buildings, what have you, and that be reciprocal in nature. The problem, though, is that doesn't always play out in real life. And this, what we've seen is the U.S. is one of the most open markets in this regard, even though we have what are called Buy American laws, which, generally tell the government to give preference to a U.S. supplier or company. We waive those. We put those aside when we have these government procurement agreements, whether it's at the WTO or bilateral agreements or what have you. So we put that aside, which means the U.S. companies don't get the preference. But we've also seen is those companies are not getting the promised access abroad in those other markets. And the GAO did a really important study on this a couple of years ago and found that the U.S. is giving up twice as much market access as the next 5 countries combined. Now, that is sure to get Donald Trump's attention. Someone who talks about, feeling ripped off or feeling like, there's not reciprocity. So it's a tricky issue. It's a complicated issue, but I certainly think there's a lot of opportunity here for some fixes and some rebalancing to make sure that we're not giving up our, procurement markets by waiving Buy American needlessly. And if we are going to do that, then we should at least get, the equivalent access abroad. All right, let's move on to the next section. This is issues related to China. And the first item under this category, Scott Paul, is the Phase 1 agreement, which was negotiated under the first Trump administration. And it was their attempt to try to get commitments from China to buy U.S. agriculture and other products. Some say it was a whole lot of noise, but not a lot of outcome. How did that end up? And what are they trying to do with an agreement that is, very old at this point?
Yeah, this is important for a couple of reasons, because it does show that a negotiation is possible, And B, China rarely lives up to it. In the first Trump administration, Trump had put a series of tariffs under what's called Section 301 on some Chinese products. The list kept getting bigger, the tariffs kept getting deeper. China did come to the table. They made this deal basically to buy more agriculture, buy more energy, buy more manufacturing goods, buy more financial services. They did none of that. And every study that's looked at it shows that they did none of that at all. The administration obviously entered into the COVID crisis before it left, and so nothing was really done to remedy that. All the tariffs that are currently in place against China basically remain in place. So I'm certain that this review will conclude that they didn't do anything. It'll be interesting to see how it concludes what should be done and whether this is one of the places that's going to provide the rationale for tariffs of up to 60% that the president has promised, Scott Bowes. Let's move to number 13. We are now more than halfway done here. This is another China piece, and this asked the U.S. Trade Ambassador to specifically review the tariffs that are already in place on Chinese products put into place by the Trump administration and the Biden administration, and also to look at any circumvention of those tariffs and to make some recommendations, Scott.
Chinese automobiles, Scott Paul. I think that's what this is about. You're right. Under the first Trump administration, tariffs were broadly applied on Chinese imports across a number of sectors. And 4 years later, as required by the Section 301 statute, the Biden administration undertook a review of those Section 301 tariffs. In many cases, affirmed them, extended them, and in some cases even increased them. So we saw for automobiles that are manufactured in China, the tariff is 100%, which is intended to be exclusionary to keep them out of the United States market because the auto sector is so important, has such a big multiplier effect. But what we've seen is that, companies in China that make automobiles, they are now looking at the opportunity to set up factories in third countries. And Mexico is the one that is getting a lot of attention right now. But there's also, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe. There's other areas where, Chinese companies are setting up these factories to make their automobiles. And the goal there by China is to do an end run and to get into our market and get around the Section 301 100% tariff. So I think what this section is intending to do is to, make sure that we beef up our actions to make sure that circumvention and that evasion cannot happen. Okay, let's move on to the next section. Similar to the last section on Section 301, Scott Paul, this one talks about whether there need to be additional investigations or actions using that Section 301 mechanism, which looks at unreasonable and discriminatory practices of China. Are there any that come to mind?
Yeah, well, I mean, there is an active Section 301 case on shipbuilding. There are a ton of unfair practices. It's worth pointing out a United States Trade Representative in the Biden administration just put out a statutory review of China's compliance with the World Trade Organization commitments. Spoiler alert, they didn't. There's also a review that USTR annually does of unfair trade practices of various countries, including China. The section is usually very thick. So there is a lot of material that should be available if this administration wants to impose additional tariffs on Chinese products. And that may be the rationale for doing this as well. Scott Bowes, any other sectors you wanted to raise up?
Well, there's a lot of emerging sectors where China is attempting to distort and dominate. Shipbuilding is, certainly a well-established one, but there's many others where it, wouldn't surprise me if there's a specific action taken to help a sector.
Absolutely. Okay, now we're going to go to number 15, and this is one of my favorites. A United States Trade Representative and the Department of Commerce will look at something called permanent normal trade relationship with China to see whether we should keep it, whether it might be modified, and related issues. Scott Bowes, why is this important? What's it about?
Well, go back about 2+ decades, and there was the promise that China would, join the international stage. We would trade more with them. Other countries would trade more with them. They'd be part of the World Trade Organization, and engaging them on an economic level. There was this idea that they would reform and they would become more market oriented, that there'd be greater emphasis on human rights. there was folly in that, and some knew it at the time. I would proudly have worked for a senator who voted to make sure that didn't happen, but it did. And I think, we stand at a point in time now in 2025 where we can all look back and say that was a mistake. China entered the world stage. They were given, permanent low tariff status through permanent normal trade relations, or PNTR as it's called. And in return, they have broken every promise. They have not lived up to their obligations at the WTO or to the United States directly. And, they have been in many ways a menace geopolitically to our allies, to Chinese dissidents here in the United States. I mean, they just don't deserve the same trade treatment as our allies like Norway, the UK, what have you. So there's a lot of interest in Congress. There's been hearings about this. A lot of really smart people have said that they don't deserve it anymore. The question is, how do you do it? When do you do it? Do you do it immediately? Is there nuance to it? There's many different tariff codes and different products. Is it a kind of a piecemeal approach to doing it? Or do you just roll back all of that preferential trade treatments? Whether it's done legislatively, and in this case, the administration is signaling that they want to see what Congress is willing to do, or perhaps done, directly through other means, remains to be seen. Okay, Scott Paul, the next section is about intellectual property rights. The president is calling on the Secretary of Commerce to look into, whether we're getting treated fairly by China on IP rights. Are we?
The short answer is no. There's a wide disparity, and U.S. businesses continue to have major issues, both formally and informally, with respect to safeguarding their intellectual property in China. Some estimates have put the loss as high as, $500 to $600 billion to our economy. For this was one of the rationales for the initial Section 301 tariffs. And so I do think that they'll find that there continues to be a lack of enforcement and measures. Meanwhile, Chinese companies are filing thousands and thousands of patent applications in the United States and globally. And so there's a wide disparity here, Scott Bowes. Let's move on to number 17, and that's where the Commerce Department, along with the Department of Defense, will conduct economic and security reviews of the industrial and manufacturing base to assess some import adjustments that may be available under some sections of trade law, including Section 232, Scott Bowes.
Right. And we'll talk a little bit more, I think, in the next section about what they're called Section 232 investigations and actions that are already in place for steel and aluminum and what needs to happen there. But with this one, this is a cue to Secretary of Commerce, who has the primary responsibility of conducting an investigation to determine whether, imports, it doesn't even have to be, unfairly traded imports, but just in general, if the presence of imports coming into the United States, diminishes our national security by undermining our own ability to maintain a steel sector or some other critical sector. Now, there's consultation with the Department of Defense because, it is considered a national security action. However, the Trump administration in its first term rightly understands that there's a clear nexus between economic welfare and security and our national defense. And there's also an understanding that, perhaps with steel, maybe the Department of Defense only uses a small amount of steel. However, it is the commercial orders that have to be robust and strong. And, if that is, infringed upon or affected by, overcapacity or surging imports, then it affects U.S. producers' ability to supply the Department of Defense. What they're looking for here is to try to assess whether we need to do more of these types of investigations that would put in a pretty broad restriction, tariff, or other sort of action to limit imports under this tool. The next section actually asks various government officials to look at the ones we already have in place, these national security Section 232 tools. Scott Paul, what are they and how could they be improved?
Yeah, so currently there are tariffs in place on a couple of product categories that we care about, steel and aluminum, and they were put into place during the first Trump administration. And over time, they've helped to stabilize the industry and allow it to make a number of investments domestically. However, there have been some alternate arrangements put into place for some countries. There have been some product exclusions in any given month. Less than half of the imports coming in steel and aluminum are subject to these Section 232. tariffs. And so I think this is going to, one of the values of this review is going to look at, can we more effectively set up a Section 232 relief measure for steel and aluminum to ensure that the law is having its intended impacts. And it's something that I know that we'll be weighing in on quite directly.
I'll just point out one
Yeah,
issue that was kind of right at the finish line and didn't get fully completed under the outgoing Biden administration was making sure that the Section 232 action on steel was extended to apply to certain downstream products, or in other words,
that's right.
derivatives, which is kind of a wonky term. But basically, these foreign countries and then producers have figured out that, they can send the steel that would otherwise be subject to a 232 tariff, they can manufacture it into the next stage downstream of the next final product, and then send that in and get around the tariffs. So, that's something that I would expect the Trump administration to take up pretty quickly because it's all queued up. Everyone's understand that it's going to happen. And, and it's important that it happened because there's, workers and companies that are affected with each day that issue does not get addressed.
Absolutely. Okay, we're down to the final five reports and recommendations here. This one, Scott Bowes, is one in which the State Department, Commerce are going to review export controls, recommend eliminating loopholes that might allow good software services technology to some of our strategic rivals and their proxies. It's worth pointing out that a ton has been done on this in a couple of administrations. So what is this going to mean, Scott?
Yeah, I mean, I think semiconductors is a good example. The United States has invested a large amount of federal dollars to making sure that we, restore U.S. leadership in semiconductors. Now, as we do that, whether it's semiconductors or any other technology, whether it's AI or quantum computing or any of these advanced technologies of the future, there's certain mechanisms the U.S. government has in place to make sure that technology and those products don't fall into the hands of adversaries, which could be used to advance their own, military, or they could reverse engineer it and steal technology. So yeah, there's different export control mechanisms that are used to protect that and to make sure that at the same time our trading partners and allies are also, complicit in kind of the theft or the access to those technology and those goods. So with that, maybe move to the next one, Scott. And this is
Sure.
connected vehicles. Credit to the Biden administration for advancing a policy and finalizing it in the final week of its administration to, protect Americans and, and manufacturers of what's called connected vehicle technology that's used in automobiles. Talk about that. Why is it important? And maybe what was left undone? Where can it go next?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things here is that there is this rulemaking process in place that the Biden administration started out for passenger vehicles, looking at the hardware and software that should, in a lot of ways down the road, make sure that these technologies can't be used by an adversary like China to spy on Americans through their car or collect data that way. And so that is important. But there are some limitations to that, and it left out some products. What about drones? I think that's a good example. Or what about commercial vehicles and buses, something we also care about? And so there's a lot of room to improve this rulemaking. And that is my hope in terms of what this connected vehicle review is going to look at, Scott Bowes. Any other thoughts there?
Just Scott, I've personally had the opportunity to sit in a number and inspect a number of these automobiles that are produced by these Chinese companies, and some of them have been disassembled and taken apart with all of the connected vehicle apparatus all over a table, whether it's microphones, sensors. It's really staggering. Today's modern cars have a lot of ways that can, a lot of tools in them that can surveil Americans directly or in mass, put our country at risk. So this is an important one.
Okay, so that's connected products. Number 21, Scott Bowes, Treasury and Commerce will review certain types of restrictions on technology, certain sanctions, and outbound investment regulations, importantly, to see if they should be strengthened or revised.
That's right, Scott. There's been bipartisan interest in Congress in monitoring U.S. dollars and investments that go out of the United States and into China. And why that's important is, we don't want U.S. interests enabling, advancement of a foreign adversary, especially when it comes to critical technologies and sectors where it can present a national security threat for our own dollars and resources to enable that rise in that foreign adversary country. So, the Biden administration took some actions to create an outbound investment screening program. It's a bit limited. I think they would even acknowledge that Congress still would need to act and do something. So I think this is important, not just for the Trump administration to try to figure out how to beef this up and make sure it works well, but also for Congress to keep working at it and figure out how to get this codified so it's durable and robust and lasts over time. Any other thing on that, Scott?
The only thing I'm going to add to that is that I think there's a lot of bipartisan interest in Congress in this, and Senator Cornyn and others care very deeply about this. So I think this is an important one for them.
That's right. Well, you've got Senator Cornyn and Congresswoman DeLauro on the same page on an issue. You're cooking with fire. All right, moving on. We're close to the end here. The next issue is a bit of an odd one, but it basically directs the Office of Management and Budget, which is a really connected part of the White House, to assess distorting impacts of foreign government financial contributions or subsidies on United States federal procurement programs and to figure out how to address that. Scott, what does that mean?
Well, this is interesting because there's been a lot of action on procurement over the last, few years. The White House stood up, Made in America office to look at the domestic preference programs, which is through OMB. This may be looking at the engagement, I guess, of foreign entities of concern that are operating domestically here. I mean, that's one thing that they could be looking at. But I will candidly say you have probably forgotten more about procurement than I'll ever know. So what sticks out to you, Scott, as well?
Well, I think this could cover a lot of ground, and this is one where I think we'll be eager to get some answers. But yeah, as you pointed out, there are Chinese entities, in some cases state-owned entities, who try to set up shop in the United States and then participate in, accessing tax dollars via federal procurement or, supplying, say, transit projects where taxpayers on the hook for paying for it. And if that's the case, Congress has already demonstrated a willingness to put restrictions in place. So whether or not that's what they meant by this, I think it's an area that they should look further into.
I agree. And finally, handing off the last one to you, Commerce and the Department of Homeland Security will examine migration and fentanyl issues and coming from Canada, Mexico, People's Republic of China, and recommend appropriate trade and national security measures. This is one that we've heard the president speak to actually many times since before and since the inauguration, Scott Bose.
Yeah, and Scott, there's a fentanyl crisis in this country, and it's really devastating to families who have lost loved ones. I've had the opportunity to speak to them directly, and their stories are very sad. Oftentimes, their child received, package by mail, sometimes through the de minimis loophole, and it had fentanyl or other contaminated product, and had that ended their life. So it's very sad. It's something that needs to be dealt with. There's a fentanyl crisis in this country. And I think, credit to President Trump for wanting to address this, as much as all of the recommendations in this broad memorandum have an April 1 timeline. I think this is probably one where the president may act sooner. He has already indicated that in recent days, saying that he may, by February 1st, seek to put tariffs in place, even on Canada and Mexico for his claim that they are, complicit in enabling or allowing fentanyl from China to come into the country. So this is one probably watch sooner than later.
Agree. I just want to wrap up by thanking you, Scott Bose, for your expertise on all of this. This is a lot to unpack in a short amount of time. So thank you.
It's been a blast.
And B, to say that we'll continue to be monitoring this very closely. You can follow us on social media. You can continue to tune into the podcast. You can read the blog. We'll be taking a very close look at all of this, the implications it's going to have for American manufacturing and American workers. But the America First trade policy memo is out, and we're getting the ball rolling here early.